Daughter-in-law thought I didn't notice when she slipped something into my purse while I was washing the dishes. She smiled and asked if I wanted more coffee. I said yes. Then I moved what she'd hidden into the zippered pocket of her own tote bag. 40 minutes later, 2 officers knocked on my front door. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this. At 63, I figured the hard chapters of my life were behind me. I'd buried my son 8 years ago, a car accident on I-80 just outside of Kearney, Nebraska, on a January morning when the roads were glazed with black ice and the sky was still dark. Nolan was 31. He'd been driving to an early shift at the distribution center where he'd worked since he was 22, putting in overtime because he and his wife had just signed a lease on a new apartment. They'd been married 4 years. No children yet, though I knew they were trying. After the funeral, my daughter-in-law Amber had nowhere to go. Her own parents were up in Minnesota, and she and her mother had a relationship I'd learned not to ask about. She was 29 and grieving and lost, and when she looked at me across the kitchen table 3 weeks after we'd put Nolan in the ground, I couldn't say no. I told her she could stay in the spare room as long as she needed to get back on her feet. That was 8 years ago. The spare room had become her room. She'd repainted it twice. The closet that used to hold Nolan's old hockey gear was now full of her things, her coats, her shoes lined up in rows, boxes I'd never been invited to look through. She worked part-time at a nail salon about 2 miles from the house, 3 days a week, Tuesday through Thursday. The other 4 days she was here, in my house, watching television, ordering takeout on my credit card, sleeping until 10. I don't want to make it sound like I resented her from the beginning. I didn't. For the first 2 or 3 years having her here was a comfort. She'd know Nolan better than anyone, and sometimes in the evenings we'd sit on the back porch and she'd tell me stories about him that I'd never heard. Small, funny things, the way he'd hum while he drove, the collection of hot sauce bottles he kept on his side of the refrigerator. Those evenings kept me going. But somewhere around year 4 something shifted. The stories about Nolan got shorter and further apart. The requests got longer and more frequent. The first one that felt off was in the spring, about 4 years in. She said her car needed a new alternator. The mechanic had quoted her $800 and she was short that month. Could I help? I wrote the check without blinking. Nolan would have wanted me to take care of her. That was the way I thought about it then. 6 months later it was dental work. $1,200. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Then it was a friend from the salon who'd gotten into trouble, some story about rent and a landlord and an eviction that needed to stop before it hit her credit. Amber needed to lend this friend $500, and could I float her until payday? I gave her the $500. I never heard about the friend again. By last year, I'd quietly added it up in my head, the way an accountant might review a ledger he doesn't want to look at too closely. Over the years since Nolan died, I had given Amber somewhere between $32,000 and $35,000, not counting the groceries, the utilities, the phone plan I'd kept her on, the streaming subscriptions I paid for that she used and I didn't. $35,000. I'm retired now. I worked 30 years as a high school chemistry teacher in Hastings, Nebraska, and when I finally turned in my classroom keys at 60, I had a decent pension, a house that was paid off, and a savings account I'd been careful about for most of my adult life. I wasn't rich by any definition, but I had enough. I'd planned for enough. $35,000 was not nothing to me. I kept telling myself it was fine, that she was family, that Nolan would have wanted this. The night everything changed started like 100 other nights. Amber came home from the salon around 7 and dropped a tote bag on the couch with a sound that told me she was tired or annoyed, and I was already at the kitchen counter, heating up soup from a can. She changed out of her work clothes and appeared in the kitchen doorway in sweatpants and a cardigan, leaning against the frame with her arms folded. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. I turned the burner down. "Okay." She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands for a moment before she looked at me. That was something I'd learned about Amber over 8 years. When she was about to ask for money, she always looked at her hands first. "There's a situation at the salon," she said. "Stacy is thinking about selling. I could buy in as a partial owner. It would be a real opportunity, but I'd need $20,000 up front." $20,000. I stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in my hand and didn't say anything for long enough that she started talking again, filling the silence with details. The business was solid, the clientele was loyal. She'd run the numbers and it would pay back within 2 years. This was a chance to actually build something rather than just working for someone else forever. Didn't I want that for her? Didn't I think Nolan would have wanted that for her? That name again. That name used like a key to a lock she knew the combination to. I need to think about it, I said. She nodded, but her jaw tightened. She'd been expecting yes. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the dark listening to the furnace run and looking at the ceiling, and I thought about Nolan, the real Nolan, the one who'd come to me when he was 17 and admitted he'd been failing geometry all semester and didn't know how to tell me. He'd been terrified. He sat on the edge of that same bed, actually, and said, "Dad, I'm sorry, I messed up." That was Nolan. When he messed up, he said so. He didn't look at his hands and talk about what Nolan would have wanted. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my own thoughts before Amber was awake. I'd been doing that more and more lately, getting up early to have an hour in my own house that felt like my own house. I thought about my sister Connie, who lived up in Omaha and had been asking me for 2 years when I was going to stop letting a 40-year-old woman live rent-free in my spare room. I'd always defended Amber. I wasn't sure I wanted to do that anymore. 3 days passed. I hadn't given Amber an answer about the $20,000, and the silence between us had grown into something with weight and edges. She was polite, professionally polite, the way a person is polite when they're managing their frustration. She cooked dinner one night, which she almost never did, a pasta dish that I recognized from a recipe card that had been my wife's. Nolan's mother, Gloria, had died of cancer 6 years before Nolan's accident. Amber had known her for about 2 years. She hadn't known her well enough to cook from her recipe cards. I didn't say any of that. I ate the pasta and said it was good. The next morning I woke up later than usual, closer to 8. I'd slept badly again. I came downstairs in my robe to find Amber already in the kitchen, showered and dressed, which was unusual for a Saturday. She was making eggs, moving around the kitchen with an energy that didn't match the tension of the past few days. She smiled when she saw me. "Good morning," she said. "I made extra if you want some." "Thank you," I said. I sat at the table and she brought me a plate and poured my coffee without being asked, and something about the whole performance made me feel the way you feel when a salesman is being very friendly right before he explains the terms. I ate and watched her talk about nothing, the weather, a podcast she'd been listening to, a neighbor's dog that had gotten into someone's garden, normal morning things, but she kept her eyes on me a half-beat longer than the conversation required. After breakfast, I said I was going to take a shower. I went upstairs, but I didn't go directly to the bathroom. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, just listening. I heard her moving around in the kitchen, the sound of the faucet, a cabinet opening, then footsteps toward the living room. I came back down quietly. I kept to the edge of the stairs where the carpet was thicker, the same spots I'd learned to avoid when Nolan was a teenager, and I was trying to catch him sneaking in past curfew. Old knowledge. Through the doorway at the bottom of the stairs I could see the living room. My purse, a large leather bag I'd had for years, dark brown, the kind that fits everything, was sitting on the side table near the front door where I always left it. Amber was standing over it. I stopped. She glanced toward the kitchen doorway and then toward the stairs, and then she reached into the front pocket of her own cardigan and took something out. A small prescription bottle. She turned it over once in her fingers, looking at it, and then she opened the main zipper of my purse and pushed it down inside, tucking it beneath my wallet. The whole thing took less than 15 seconds. She re-zipped the purse and walked toward the kitchen like nothing had happened, like she'd just been passing through. I stood on the stairs with my hand on the railing and my mind doing something I can only describe as very cold and very fast, the way it used to operate during exams when I was younger, when everything slowed down and the right answer became clear. I waited until I heard the kitchen faucet turn on again. Then I came down the stairs and walked to the side table. I unzipped my purse and reached inside. The prescription bottle was small, orange, the label facing down. I turned it over. The name on the label was not mine. It was a name I didn't recognize, a woman's name, and the prescription was for a controlled substance, a painkiller, the kind that has been in the news for years in a way that means something serious when you're found with a bottle that isn't yours. I held it for a moment thinking. I thought about the $20,000. I thought about 8 years. I thought about my wife's recipe card. Then I walked to where Amber's tote bag was sitting on the couch, the same one she'd dropped there the night before. I unzipped the inside pocket and placed the prescription bottle at the bottom of it, under a folded scarf and what looked like a spare phone charger. I zipped it closed and set the bag back exactly as it had been. Then I went upstairs and took my shower. I don't know how long I stood under the hot water, long enough for the bathroom to fill completely with steam. I kept thinking about what would happen next, running the scenarios the way an engineer, or in my case, a retired chemistry teacher, tends to do. Follow the chain of events. If A, then B. If B, then C. I had a neighbour, a retired county sheriff's deputy named Wallace, who I'd known for about 12 years. We shared a fence line and an occasional beer on Saturday evenings when the weather was decent. I trusted him more than I trusted most people. I thought about calling him. I thought about calling Connie. I thought about calling the non-emergency police line and asking a hypothetical question about what it meant when someone put a controlled substance in another person's belongings. I decided the best thing I could do was go about my morning exactly as planned. I came downstairs dressed, my hair still damp. Amber was in the living room with her laptop, doing something on the screen that she angled away slightly when I walked in. I told her I was going to the hardware store. I needed a new washer for the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for 2 weeks. She said okay without looking up. I picked up my purse from the side table and walked to my car. I sat in the driveway for about 3 minutes just breathing. Then I drove to Wallace's house, which was 4 houses down on the same street. He answered the door in a flannel shirt and work boots, the kind of man who is never entirely off duty even in retirement. I told him what I'd seen. I told him calmly, in the sequence it had happened, the way you'd give a statement, which I suppose is exactly what I was doing. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You moved it," he said. "I did." "To her bag?" "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay. You know what I'd do? I'd call the non-emergency line and I'd tell them exactly what you just told me. Don't accuse her of anything. Just tell them what you observed. Let them decide what to do with it." "She might have already called them," I said. "About me." Wallace looked at me for a beat. "Then you'd better call first." I used his phone. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because I wanted a witness for the call. Maybe because my own hands weren't entirely steady. The dispatcher was patient and professional. I explained that I was 63 years old, that I lived alone with my daughter-in-law, that I had observed her place what appeared to be a prescription bottle that didn't belong to either of us inside my personal bag, and that I had subsequently moved the item to her bag for my own safety. I gave my address. The dispatcher said someone would come by. I thanked Wallace and walked back to my house. I let myself in through the front door and hung my keys on the hook. Amber was still on the couch with the laptop. She looked up. "That was fast," she said. "They didn't have the right size," I said. "I'm going to try the other location." She nodded. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it, looking at the backyard through the window. Nolan had learned to ride his bicycle in that backyard on the strip of grass beside the garden bed where I used to grow tomatoes. The tomatoes were gone. I hadn't planted any in years. The knock came about 40 minutes later. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both in uniform. The woman introduced herself as Officer Delgado. She was calm and direct, and she asked if she could come inside. I said of course. Amber appeared from the hallway, and I saw the exact moment she understood what was happening. A flicker behind her eyes, quickly controlled. "We received a report about a controlled substance," Officer Delgado said, looking between us. "We'd like to ask a few questions." "I reported it," I said, "about 40 minutes ago." Amber's expression rearranged itself very quickly. "I don't know what's going on," she said. She looked at me. "What did you do?" "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. Officer Delgado asked if anyone had a problem with them looking around. I said I didn't. Amber said she absolutely did. She had rights. She didn't consent to any search. Officer Delgado made a note of that. Her partner asked me where the item was that I'd observed. I moved it, I said, after I saw her put it in my purse. I put it in her tote bag. The one on the couch. Amber started talking, quickly then louder. She said I was confused, that I was getting older and I misremembered things, that she'd never touched my purse, that she didn't know what was in her own bag, that this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding between an elderly man and a younger woman who'd given up years of her life to take care of him. I didn't respond. I stood with my hands at my sides and let her talk. Officer Delgado's partner, who had barely said a word, picked up the tote bag from the couch. He asked Amber if she'd consent to him looking inside since she lived in the home. She said no. He set it down. Then Officer Delgado explained that given the circumstances, a call from the resident, the conflicting accounts, and the visible distress of one party, they had sufficient reason to believe there may be evidence of a crime. She cited the specific provision calmly. I didn't know the statute number, but I'd asked Wallace about this exact question earlier, and he'd walked me through it. Amber stopped talking. They found the bottle in the inside pocket, under the scarf, exactly where I'd put it. The name on the label was someone none of us knew. Officer Delgado turned the bottle over and looked at the name for a long moment. "Ma'am," she said to Amber, "do you know a person by this name?" Amber said nothing. I said nothing either. I watched my daughter-in-law's face and tried to find in it some trace of the young woman who had sat on my back porch and told me about Nolan's hot sauce collection and the way he hummed when he drove. I couldn't find her anymore. The officers made calls. More information came back. The name on the bottle was connected to a case that had apparently been open for several weeks, involving prescriptions being filled and sold in the area. The kind of case that turns small towns into cautionary news stories. Amber's name surfaced in connection with that case within the hour, which meant the officers on my living room couch had more to work with than an old man's word against his daughter-in-law's. They asked Amber to come with them. She was not handcuffed in my living room. They were professional about it, patient, gave her time to put on shoes and get her cardigan, but she went. At the door she turned and looked at me. Her face was hard to read. Not remorse exactly, more like the expression of someone who had bet on a particular outcome and was recalculating. "I took care of you," she said. "You lived here," I said. "That's not the same thing." The door closed. I stood in the living room for a while after that, not doing anything in particular. The tote bag was still on the couch. The plate from breakfast was still on the kitchen table. Outside, a pair of cardinals were working their way through the bird feeder I'd hung on the fence post 3 winters ago. I called Connie that evening. She drove down from Omaha the next morning and sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and didn't say anything for a while, which I appreciated. She knew me well enough to know I didn't need someone to narrate what had happened. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. "Talk to a lawyer," I said. "About the house, about the money, about what can be recovered." "And after that?" I thought about it. I'd been thinking about it since the officers left. I had a retired teacher's pension that covered the basics. The house was paid off. I had a sister in Omaha who had been asking me for 2 years to move closer to her. I had a backyard I hadn't planted tomatoes in since I stopped hoping someone else would help me eat them. "I think I might put the house on the market," I said. Connie looked at me carefully. "You sure?" "I'm sure that I don't want to walk through those rooms for the next 10 years, I said. "Everything in this house has her in it now, all the version of her I thought she was." Connie nodded. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers for a moment, the way she used to when we were children, and one of us had done something we hadn't meant to do and couldn't undo. The lawyer I found in town was a woman about 10 years younger than me, direct and no nonsense. The kind of person who wrote things on a legal pad in very small handwriting and didn't waste sentences. She told me what I'd expected, the money I'd given Amber over the years, absent any written agreement calling it a loan, would be difficult to recover. It had been given as gifts, and gifts don't come back. She could help me document what she could, and she advised me to get Amber formally off the lease, off the utilities, off anything with my name on it. The criminal case moved separately from any of that. Amber was charged with possession with intent to distribute and with filing a false statement. She had apparently told the officers initially that the bottle must have been placed in her bag by me, which became its own problem for her when the timeline and the phone records and a text message from a number associated with the open case all pointed in a different direction. I wasn't in the courtroom for most of it. My statement had been given early, and the prosecutors told me they'd call me only if they needed to. They didn't end up needing to. The evidence handled itself. I heard the outcome from my lawyer on a Thursday afternoon while I was pulling weeds from the flower bed along the front walk, the first time I'd touched the garden in probably 2 years. Amber had accepted a plea, 18 months with eligibility for supervised release after 12 if she completed the required program. Her attorney had argued for leniency on account of her prior history and the mitigating circumstances. The prosecutor had not argued against leniency entirely, but had pushed to keep the possession charge intact. My lawyer's voice on the phone was measured, professional. She told me the outcome is a set of facts. I thanked her and hung up and went back to the weeding. I thought about Nolan. I tried to imagine his face if he could have seen the last few years, the way his wife had slowly turned the grief of losing him into a financial arrangement, the way she'd learned to use his memory as currency. I don't know what he would have thought. He was a good man, my son. He was honest and a little stubborn, and he worked hard and he loved his wife. I think that last part would have been the hardest thing for him, not the money. The love. The house sold in 11 days. The real estate agent was surprised. I wasn't. He was a good neighborhood, the kind of block where people watered their lawns and knew each other's names, and the market in that part of Nebraska had been strong for years. I took the equity and put most of it in an account I hadn't touched since I opened it, the one I'd been building since I was 32 with the intention of leaving something to Nolan. That intention needed a new shape now, but I wasn't ready to figure that out yet. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Omaha 6 minutes from Connie's house. The complex had a small courtyard with a raised garden bed that residents could reserve in the spring. I put my name on the list for one of the plots. I was thinking about tomatoes. The first Saturday after I moved in, Connie came over with groceries and made a pot of chili from scratch, the same recipe our mother had used, and we ate it at my small kitchen table while snow came down outside the window. She told me about a widower she'd met at her church who had a similar story, a nephew, not a daughter-in-law, but the same slow architecture of dependency and extraction. I listened. I wasn't surprised anymore by how many versions of this story existed. "Do you feel bad?" Connie asked at one point. Not accusing, just curious. I thought about it honestly. "I feel like I kept a promise to Nolan for a long time," I said. "Longer than I had to, and then I stopped." "That's not bad," she said. "No," I said. "I don't think it is." Outside the window, the snow was sticking to the tops of the parked cars and to the branches of the bare trees along the street. It was the quiet kind of snowfall, the kind that softens everything, makes the world feel a little smaller and more manageable. I hadn't felt that particular kind of quiet in a long time. I sat with it for a while, both hands around my coffee cup, and let it be what it was. I think about the morning Amber stood at my kitchen counter, making eggs, moving with that careful cheerfulness, and I wonder how long she'd been rehearsing it. Not just that morning. Years, maybe. The slow practice of learning which words unlocked me, which silences made me feel guilty enough to write another check. She'd studied me the way you study a house before you decide to move in. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think it matters to look at what actually happened, not the version that's easier to carry. What I know is this: the people who take advantage of good-hearted people don't usually announce themselves. They arrive in grief. They arrive when you're lonely and your son is barely in the ground and you can't stand the thought of sending away the last person who knew him the way you did. Amber didn't choose me randomly. She chose me because I was the kind of man who believed that loyalty meant staying, that love meant giving, that a decent person didn't count the cost. Those aren't bad instincts, but instincts without judgment are just vulnerability waiting to be found. What kept me from losing everything that morning wasn't luck. It was 30 years of teaching chemistry, of learning to observe before you react, to follow the sequence of evidence rather than the story someone is trying to sell you. When I saw Amber standing over my purse, my first thought wasn't rage. It was cold and precise. Something is wrong, and I need to understand it before I do anything at all. That kind of thinking doesn't come from fear. It comes from having built the habit slowly over a lifetime of trusting what you actually see over what you want to believe. I think about Nolan sometimes when I consider all of this. He was honest in a way that cost him things. He admitted when he failed. He didn't craft stories about other people to protect himself. I raised him to be that way, and I believe he was that way, all the way to the end. Amber had learned to use his memory like a tool, but she never understood what actually made him worth remembering. There's a kind of strength that looks like softness from the outside, staying quiet in a hard moment, not fighting when someone expects you to fight, letting things unfold rather than forcing them. I moved that prescription bottle into a bag and then I went upstairs and took a shower and let the hot water run, and that discipline, that patience, was the thing that protected me when the officers came to my door. Not anger, not cleverness. Steadiness. The hardest thing I've had to sit with is the years I gave freely and lost. $35,000, 8 years of shared meals and covered bills, and the slow erosion of a retirement I'd spent decades building. I can't recover that. My lawyer was plain about it. What I can do is understand how it happened, not to punish myself, but so that the next chapter of my life is built on something sturdier than obligation dressed up as love. The garden plot at my new apartment complex is small. Room for tomatoes, maybe some herbs along the edge. I put my name on the list in February, and when the ground thawed, I was the first one out there with a trowel. That sounds small, but after years of not planting anything because I'd stopped expecting to be around to harvest it, it felt like a beginning. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the trial, not the plea agreement, not even the morning the officers led Amber to their car. What I keep coming back to is the drive north to Omaha with my truck loaded and the windows down, and the particular feeling of moving towards something rather than away from it, of choosing what comes next instead of maintaining what had already broken. The snow outside my new window sticks to the parked cars and the bare branches of the trees along the street, and the quiet it makes is the kind I've been looking for a long time.